Yeah, if you speak, it'll.
Oh, okay.
It thinks I'm you, I think.
That'll be convenient. Can you disable that feature? Because do you think it's going to be that useful? It seems to be getting both of us in view.
It doesn't even matter. Like, we have so many avenues at this point. 2 recorders and the 1 audio. Let me get my Sprite. But guess we can start off slow before blasting off. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Gustavo de Souza. I'm a math PhD student at the University of Texas at Arlington. And excited to chat with Joe about some interesting things.
Okay, I will speak up because I don't even know if that's going to pick up our audio. But yeah, and this is Joseph Anthony, my little pen name, pseudonym. It's just my name, my first and middle initial. We're at my house right now, my parents' house, I should say. But yeah, this is actually my first time meeting Gustavo. We met through the Qualia Research Institute Discord channel, server, I should say. And it's been interesting. Like, we were kind of the only people who had more of a skeptical view of that server and the people in that server. Not to dismiss any of them, they're all great, interesting people, but we decided to make our own server. And we call that the Cyborg Nest, or the Cyber Hemispherical Table, or Slate, whatever you want to call it, originally called the Cybernetic Flat Table. But I don't want to make this too formal because it's going to make us rigid and try to like expect certain things out of us. So I guess one thing that's our common ground is something over here. I have a neuroscience bachelor's. Gus has a deep interest in perception science. And right here we have, if you can see it, probably not, but it's Grossberg's Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain. I took off the cover. You could probably speak on this better than I could, but I think Grossberg is an interesting example of somebody who takes perception more seriously than, dare I say, the Qualia Research Institute. Is there anything in here that you know, like a page by hand or something, or a chapter?
I believe I only read up to 120, page 121. It is a very informationally dense book, but at least up until then, Grossberg does a very good job, dare I say, a very elegant job of breaking down the mathematics of perception and how that works. So if there's any way that Grossberg diverges from the current paradigm in machine learning and deep learning and this whole field of machine intelligence, is that he starts from the observed properties of perception as we know it. He's interested in biological learning and extracting a learning algorithm from that.
So is that observed aspect what a layman would refer to as phenomenology? Or is it more nuanced than that?
Yeah, there's definitely so if you go to, what page are you on? Let's take a look here. If you just look at some of these pages here, so a lot of equations here. I don't know if it's probably not visible in the video, but he does a very good job at explaining some basic features of perception that are kind of standard and have been known for like over a century. Beginning of the 20th century, you had the Gestalt school of psychology. They were very interested in explaining how the visual system essentially solves the inverse optics problem. how do you go from the two-dimensional retinal image to an actual 3D percept, and they came up with a series of different laws of visual perception, if you will, that explain how we group different visual features into a single coherent whole. And so an example, if you don't mind, would be I believe it's pronounced Kanizsa triangle, which many of you have probably seen before. It's like the three Pac-Man figures where they're all aligned collinearly such that they form the percept of a triangle. And all these things might just come across as interesting oddities of perception, but they actually, or at least the premise of this kind of approach is that you can learn a lot about perception. And well, this is the Kanizsa square, I suppose, which is the same principle. So the top, I believe, would be the top left or top right, depending over here. I'll just point to it. There is this percept of a square, even though there is no square there. Right? What was the point I was making? Yeah, so even though these might just come across as curious little visual oddities of visual perception, they actually tell you a lot about how the visual system works in humans. And so that's essentially what he's doing here. He's coming up with a mathematical model of how the brain actually processes visual input. And a lot of that comes down to explaining how we solve the perceptual constancy problem. So if you look at this book here, the side that's facing you directly is slightly darker than maybe this, like the left-hand side, although they probably can't see it, but you immediately know that the color of this object is not different in different parts. It's just the illumination is different. And so that's another thing that is easily overlooked.
You said it was called perceptual constancy.
Yeah, brightness constancy, size, brightness constancy, color constancy, size constancy, and shape constancy.
So I know a couple more problems that I want to get to with you, but I'm curious, okay, so you have the inverse optics problem you described. How do you get a 2D retinal image into a video frame, right?
Into a three-dimensional shape.
Okay, so into more of a rising or splat, if you will.
Yeah.
And I want to get to that. Then you have the perceptual constancy problem. When it comes to we have two domains that are kind of almost isomorphic to each other, and they try to solve the problem. And I know you're not a fan of the latter, which I'm about to say, but there's empirical neurology, like V1 through V5 and MT, this whole neuron kind of model or whole neuron fact that is allowing or facilitating for these kind of inverse optics and perceptual constancy and binding. Maybe this is the other one I want to mention.
Yeah.
And the latter is machine learning.
Yeah.
So you have all this shunting problems, and you have what is it called, like space shunting or contrast, and all these several problems. But when you look at what we've devised, people like Maurice Weiler and Max Welling with equivariance, that's not attractive to you at all. The fact that they're able to have, I know there's more nuance than how I'm framing it, but they have a model that takes into account contrast and variance. We have built AI models that take into account these various types of feature and variance.
Which is all built on top of which optimization algorithm? Backpropagation. Backpropagation.
Yeah, backpropagation.
You need label data, but I think even without mentioning these cutting edge deep learning architectures, if you're just talking about convolutional neural networks, if we start actually from even a simpler kind of architecture, yes, there are some analogies in the kinds of features that they learn across the layers. Like you have local contrast detection, then edge detection, then maybe shape detection, and then finally the actual object category the problem with these architectures and what's different about them relative to how biological systems do perception is that, like we just mentioned, they do so in a supervised manner. They need tons of label data, and there's a ton that we can go into there. So I'll try to restrict myself to not make that the entirety of the conversation, because that's like a whole rabbit hole. But when you use something like a backpropagation algorithm, right? Number one, there is this problem of that ultimately the only thing that you're representing, so in spite of the fact that there's this analogy between the feature detection pipeline, edges, local contrast detection, edges, shape, object category at the final end, what the network is only representing at the very end is just the category. So you present your convolutional neural network with you train it on like cats versus dogs, and then you present to it an image of a cat. All it's ultimately seeing when you're running it in inference mode is the category label, right? And so this is a significant disanalogy between biological perception and machine perception within the current supervised backpropagation model, which is that when you look at an object, you don't just see the actual object categories, you're actually seeing the entire feature hierarchy simultaneously. And that is related to what you kind of already mentioned, which is like binding. And so what does that mean, or what is the actual issue there? There are these things called adversarial examples, which mean that you can ever so slightly change the pixel intensity values of an image to make a network completely misclassify an image that prior to that injection of noise, it correctly classified it. And this noise is something you would never even notice in the image. So then, well, you could say, yeah, you don't notice it because it's below the just noticeable difference. It's too small for the human visual system to notice. But the thing is, you can inject a significant amount of noise up until, you just completely distort the image and like no learning algorithm would get it. But like even before that, the point is that we don't just use the first pass, the first input layer. We don't use pixel values, and so pixel values, and then ultimately just map them to a category level. We have this entire pipeline that is bound together, and then we can talk about what the binding actually means. That goes into the whole, hopefully, or maybe we'll talk about like synchrony and resonance and oscillation and that entire paradigm. But the issue with that is that the very same algorithm that we use to train these networks allows for you to find these examples that completely fool the network.
Okay, so you have the Grossbergian observer aspect or phenomenological aspect. You have the machine learning or machine perception aspect. And then the other side we kind of glossed over is there is the neurological aspect, right? There's the hardware to the software of the Grossbergian software, so to speak. So my question, I guess, is like, is there any utility? Like a lot of people are doing this now with, what was the name of that institute? The Allen Institute did the neurofluid model I mentioned, where they actually simulated basically a mock biophysics model of the 7 layers of the brain. It was actually the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is, as you know, part of the thalamus, which is related to retinal optics. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, but do you see any like real, and they were able to find, if I remember that Allen Institute research correct, and I will put it in the description, there was an ability for a mock or in silico Murian model to infer some gestalts, like visual gestalts, beyond edges from this biophysics model where the particle is a whole cell of the LGN. So my question to you is, we've had this pushback before, as you know, I'm a biophysics guy, Gus is like a neuroscience and perception guy. We both
neuroscience.
I'm sorry?
Mathematical neuroscience.
Mathematical
not
neuroscience.
Not just a vanilla neuroscience guy.
Yeah.
No offense to the experimentalists.
No offense, guys.
No offense to the experimentalists.
Yeah, we're trying to do some theoretical work here, and then hopefully apply it. But I guess what I wanted to say was, do you see the utility? You mentioned before, like this. Is it really pay? And you mentioned this about Jen too. Like, does it really pay to have a whole atom or whole particle conception of something in order to minimize prediction error or have like a really good model? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's the problem with the machine learning architecture, is that it treats the feature hierarchy stack is, the idea is, and this isn't a new idea, right? This idea goes back to like David Hume, up to Helmholtz, and the idea is that, okay, perception consists of like little pieces that are put together into bigger pieces that then get put into even bigger pieces, and then at some point you have essentially you have this process of hierarchical compositionality, of which there is, but that's not the entire story, and that by itself cannot explain certain aspects of biological perception and its robustness, unlike the machine learning architecture, because there's a sense in which, okay, this atomistic view where small pieces come together and make bigger pieces, it's purely feed forward. There's no feedback. And so what ends up happening, okay, so you have the CNN that develops a feature hierarchy very similar to the feature hierarchy that we find in the brain. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that there aren't edge detectors, that there aren't surface surface detectors, that kind of stuff. There obviously is that pipeline, but it's the way it's put together, and it's the fact that there's a lot of feedback connections, and it's not just a purely feed-forward feature extraction process. So
Which aspect are you referring to, machine learning or neurology?
I'm saying, yeah, neurology is not just purely feed-forward.
There's loops. There's loops in neurology. There's also, I'm sorry, were you finished?
No, yeah, go ahead.
There's also empirical media coming out about this idea that calcium modulation is like an ice. I hate to say this because it's not. They're trying to map. There's headlines that try to map empirical findings with like machine learning, or empirical findings with aspects of it. Basically, they're saying that calcium modulation in the, I believe, IPS and EPSPs has to do with has to create an analogy with. Ends up creating an analogy, I should say, with backpropagation. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So this is all, now of course what they're putting out there, that media could be is obviously politically coded. It would make a lot of sense for them to make a headline like that, backpropagation and neurology, in the same sentence, when there really may not be that type of relationship. But I do just want to offer that as one, as you mentioned, there are loops in surface detection, edge detection, in neurology. That's, kind of how we presuppose the layers end up working. But there's also this strange area where they're considering the backprop. I don't want to like burden or bastardize the conversation with that point. I just kind of want to offer it to them as like a, food fodder.
Yeah.
So I can see where the machine perception aspect is not that good, especially with your adversarial argument. That makes perfect sense why like just a little pixel will change an image of a gorilla into an image of a cat or something, right? That's part of adversarial misclassification. Then self-supervised learning or supervised learning is also part of that and could be seen as like a massive, I don't want to wager it as a waste of time, because that's what JEPA is based on. JEPA is based on self-supervised learning, and they seem to be making headway with world modeling since, I don't know, however many years JEPA has been out. So I think it's been longer than 20 years, the original conception anyway. But so we have the observer aspect and the empirical or neurological aspect. I wouldn't even call the observer aspect empirical, right? Because it's more phenomenological. You cannot verify your own personal experience. But I'm interested in this mapping of functor, if you will, between the neurological and the phenomenological, or the Grossbergian conception, the software and the hardware, so to speak. So I would just offer like, yeah, we don't need to have this Humean kind of like, you add up all this stuff, but the sum is greater than its parts, right? What if we just had a 7-layer model that abstracts away all the atoms and just considers the dynamics of how the Arbor network works? There's even a neuro package on Python, I believe, called Arbor, where people like my old PI, Vincenzo Carnevale, has done some work basically using neuromorpho-like like geometries and stitching them together, and these geometries represent axons and chandelier cells and all these different types of cells, and they're loop based, of course. So where I'm going with this is, yeah, let's abstract away like everything from quantum strings to atoms and receptors, or maybe not receptors, but this is where we will diverge. But at least you have the dynamics of an arborist system. Is understanding that model, that arborist system, scale abstracted to sufficient and necessary degree, not isomorphic to your Grossbergian experience or your phenomenology or your observer aspect?
Could be.
Okay.
As long as you can reproduce the same performance, I guess. Yeah, there's an interesting, you bring up an interesting point about, at least inadvertently, you bring up a point about like at what point do you cap out the biological detail to try to reproduce the stuff, and it's unclear because the brain doesn't have a convenient separation between hardware and software, between computation and physical implementation. The computation is the brain's physical dynamics, so it's kind of hard to like separate that. Digital computers are kind of designed to have that separation, they're designed to be that way, because that means you can run the same algorithm on a different machine. But a brain is not. A brain computes through its physical structure. And you could say the same thing about a computer in a way, because there's still transistors and stuff, but there isn't the same transferability of that computation across mediums.
This is just an aside I want to throw out there, but a lot of the time we talk about brain as if it's separate and distinct from the body. I'm just throwing it as an aside because I know it's kind of one of those like, it's kind of like one of those cop-out we were talking about on the deck, or like, let me give a metaphysical kind of offer, but I won't do that. But just this idea of like an activism, right?
Yeah, that's super important.
Yeah, so this is necessary. Also, like, I want to find a way to dabble into what you were mentioning about, synchrony, right? Like, we know that biological neural networks have oscillatory dynamics, right? So at what point is that scale equivariant, or does that persist across all scales, from the neurological to the phenomenological or observer aspect that Grossberg would be working with? I'm curious about
the first level you mentioned?
the neurological.
Well, what I would say is, okay, so if phenomenology, if the actual conscious experience you're having right now, the information embedded in a moment of conscious experience, well, this is an ontological commitment that I personally have, and I think it's not an ontological commitment that's like just in the air without any empirical grounding. I think there's probably good evidence for this. There is good evidence for this, but essentially the Gestalt isomorphism idea, like the Gestalt psychologists already had this idea early in the 20th century of whatever is in a moment of conscious experience, there's got to be some aspect of the brain dynamics that corresponds to that particular part of your experience. So your experience as a whole, there's got to be some subset of brain dynamics that is isomorphic up to measurement error, or your ability to properly measure that is isomorphic to the information content in a moment of conscious experience. So if we start from that, then what you have is not, the question is not like at what point are they equivalent. It's which scale, up to which scale and down to which scale do you have isomorphism between the neural dynamics and the information content in a conscious experience. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. It's something that I need to kind of brush up on. I do want to converge on like neuroscience later. A lot of the work I do with biophysics is neuroscience coded. Anything from my master's thesis to the stuff Enzo works on is very like for example, the TRP voltage gated receptor. TRP1 is related to not only like wasabi, it receives like the capsaicin or the wasabi from the gustatory center, but it also receives temperature and nociception. If I'm not mistaken, nociception. So you can see there that whatever he's studying on this scale, and I don't mean to sidestep from oscillatory kind of synchrony, but just as an interesting, yet another aside, it's interesting. You can see how TRP is related to cognition, right? Like it's a qualia receptor, if you will. I don't know. We can, if you want to get fringe for the sake of conferring more about oscillatory dynamics, we can, because we already do. I don't mean to glaze him, but he's doing a better job than QRI. I don't mean to be mean to QRI, but I don't know if you want to go anywhere with this. We can also take some look at the books. This one's not that useful.
Yeah, Grossberg, I'm not aware that he obviously talks a lot about resonance, but then the main sort of contemporary model that actually covers this oscillatory dynamics is something that I think comes much later.
Well, how about for the audience and to remind me, because I don't know what Grossberg means by, can you just define resonance?
Yeah, so resonance, at least in the way that Grossberg thinks about it, is a kind of mutually reinforcing feedback loop, or like a limit cycle in a dynamical system where activity gets sustained over time. So I do have some questions about what the actual physiological implementation of that could look like. But I mean, if you just look at the high level abstraction of like the vertical connections, so across layers, not the horizontal connections within a layer, but the vertical connections across the layers of the cortex, right? You have this like common motif of excitatory population. So you have like these two main units. The excitatory unit, I guess the excitatory unit is here on the bottom. It excites this one, and this one inhibits this one. And they each inhibit, like the excitatory excites itself, and the inhibitory inhibits itself. From just that common motif, you can already reproduce a lot of like oscillatory dynamics, and that's actually kind of the that is also what gives way naturally to a kind of learning algorithm like predictive coding.
You know what that reminds me of, and it goes back to what you were saying about computation being like the software-hardware distinction being opaque, or like difficult to disambiguate. You're reminding me of the cyberneticist Valentino Breitenberg. Do you remember his book Vehicles?
No, I'm not familiar with
Vehicles was a simple book about taking two systems or like two nodes that have some type of dynamic or learning rule, and you add like another one that essentially you end up with all these little vehicles, but they express emotion. They express a fear of the light or an attraction toward the light. So attraction, repulsion, valence. So it's not really a question, more of like a synthesis. Like we have like these, like you said, the vertical axis of the 7 layers has the excitatory and inhibitory. Well, you also have that similar simple model for Breitenberg's idea in his schematic of vehicles, which gives rise to these personality-clad, emotion-clad kind of entities. I think it's interesting, maybe people, again, I'm gonna banish myself to like low caliber conversation, but you hear a lot of these people talk about like emotions having higher selves or having this type of energy about them, when in reality it's the result of these learning rules that are experiencing like synchrony or some type of, is that right? Or like
I don't know how to, I'm not sure how I would map that onto like from a neurological standpoint. I feel like we'd have to operationalize that a bit more if we wanted to see if there's like an equivalence.
I mean, are you a proponent of the modular hypothesis?
Modularity in the brain?
Yeah, like
I
the
mean, yeah, there's
limbic
definitely
system.
modularity. I mean, like the limbic system, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Like for sure. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I think what's interesting, I guess well, it's not easy, but when you're talking about perception, you can kind of ignore modularity and just deal with the cortical sheet, the 7 layers, since it's, I could be wrong here, so if anyone in the comments is aware of this, let me know. But my understanding is that a lot of the hierarchical learning is happening throughout the cortical layers, and there's a reason we have this extra layer of cortex that gives us more intelligence relative to other species, because you could say in a way having like a larger vertical axis allows you to integrate information over longer periods of time to identify both finer and coarser spatiotemporal regularities. And so the cortex seems to be really like that, the laminar architecture of the cortex, which Grossberg is really big on in his kind of, you could say at its basis, his model is kind of a model of cortical function. And I guess I should clarify that the Wilson-Cohen dynamics, even though they are you could say a very common motif, I'm not entirely sure what the consensus is on that, because at least Grossberg, the way he thinks of it is that it's not inhibitory, or I guess inhibitory, excitatory. It's actually excitatory both ways, and that's how you get the resonance. It's how you get a self-sustaining limit cycle in the system. So like there's probably like details to flesh out and look at, okay, if you use this kind of connection versus that kind of connection, what kind of dynamics do you get? How do they differ? But the point is that learning and perception, right? And this is the interesting thing, right? Are learning and perception different, right? When you're learning something versus perceiving something. When I look at that bottle right there, right? I'm well acquainted with a bottle of Sprite. I know what it looks like. There's a sense in which, like, when there's not any information that's new, what you're doing is perceiving, almost like a neural network is inferring after you've already trained it. And I wonder, like, if there's a meaningful distinction to be made there, but I think that in the same way that the brain doesn't have a clear distinction between hardware and software, we also know that the brain does not have a clear distinction between learning and inference in the same way that machine learning. There's something, okay, and sorry I kind of cut you off, but
we have something for post-mortem tissue, this is just preface, called HIP-CT, or hierarchical phase contrast tomography, which allows you to actually look into the cellular level with cellular resolution, I should say, to post-mortem tissue. Well, going back to this whole talk of people like Orwellian neural meritocracy or whatever, what if you had, to test a disambiguation between perception and learning, what if you had a way to do a scan in real time, and I know we don't, but if you did, where you could see the long-term potentiation and long-term depression densities and see that differential between the two presupposed states or tasks, perception and learning. That would give you that would confirm or deny the hypothesis whether they're two distinct things. And it seems like if you think if anyone thinks for a few seconds about it, who understands what we're saying, they would say, well, yeah, there probably is a differential, right? You're more likely to potentiate calcium and,
when you're learning new information,
sodium and all that, when you're learning new information versus when and same with forgetting, right? That's an interesting question about how far gone machine learning is in terms of an isomorphy or isotopy, if you will, to neuroscience, is that we don't have catastrophic forgetting.
Yeah.
What that would mean is that long-term depression in a neurological human agent just spikes incredibly exponentially, causing the system to just forget wherever it's at. And I guess under certain drugs that does happen, but it seems like when I'm observing this, there's very little spike timing dependent plasticity with respect to a task. So it seems like learning is a category of a task or a procedure. Now, if I open the book, right, I'm not going to open a baby book like the Tao Te Ching, but maybe if I open up weak links, I'd be careful. So if I go to the table of contents, I'm going to inevitably be doing some type of associative reasoning or associative memory, if I can find the table of context. Small worldness, scale freeness, scale free degree distribution of networks, scale free distribution in time, probabilities, survival strategies, levy flights, scale free pleasures. This is a weird book. And the point I'm trying to draw here is that as I actually read these pages, there's more potentiation probably happening. Would you agree with that or no?
Yeah,
I know you're not really learning.
there's definitely a difference between perceiving something you've already learned, or coming across a sensory experience that you're well acquainted with versus one that you're not so well acquainted with. But the difference is not clear cut in the same way that it is for machine learning, where you have a learning phase and then a training phase and then an inference phase, right? These two processes are happening. I don't want to say in parallel. I mean, you could say it's more of a bootstrapping process where you're constantly inferring something and comparing that inference with the actual information that you received, and obviously that already tells you what I'm referring to there, which is predictive coding at some level. But there's also, that's another thing, right? It's like there's also a lot of questions about predictive coding and whether it can actually account for the perception side, because the issue with predictive coding is it reduces all bottom-up activity to bottom-up activity is just like prediction error. So top-down activity is prediction. The top-down activity is thought to be inhibitory. The bottom-up activity is thought to be excitatory. So whenever there's newsworthy activity, that drives learning. So then when there is no newsworthy activity, that would mean there would be no activity, because the connection going down is inhibitory. But that's preposterous, because then that would mean that when you're perceiving something that you've already seen, there would be no activity. And that does not make any sense. You're explaining something with nothing. And more importantly, what that implies is that if you think of let me be careful here. I don't want to make an analogy that isn't like precise here, that doesn't actually capture the dynamics. But the issue is that, okay, if you correctly perceive this book, its shape, when I rotate it, no surprise there. You're good at solving the inverse optics problem by this time in your life, right? Everyone can do that. And then this one, same thing here. Both of these will induce zero activity under a predictive coding view. So then how do you distinguish between them? They're both zero. It's like they're both being sent to the kernel of the linear transformation. If you think of the linear transformation as being like the neural activity, which is transforming that neural activity into a percept. You could think of it that way very, very loosely. And so again, I'll try to be careful here with the usage of a mathematical terminology, but then the issue is you don't have that one-to-oneness to it. And then so how do you distinguish between two things that you've already learned when they both induce zero activity? That's like the main issue with predictive coding in my view. It could explain learning, but then once learning happens, it's like, okay, no activity. So then what happens? So that's why I'm more partial to the Grossbergian idea that actually you don't just have feedback connections being inhibitory. You have feedback connections also excitatory, and then you have inhibitory interneurons, which regulate the stability and the plasticity, right? Because I think what you mentioned here with the catastrophic forgetting and stuff is ultimately the problem that he's trying to solve in this book, which is the stability-plasticity dilemma. How do you learn new information, plasticity, without forgetting old information? Because you need stability as well, and that's like a big part of the brain. I think that's like something that we haven't found out at least how to build that into our artificially intelligent system.
So just to rephrase, learning, stability, and depression or forgetting. Those are the three things we don't understand how they kind of dynamically interact with each other, or modeling in terms of modeling.
Yeah, I mean I feel like we definitely don't understand it fully. I mean, we have some idea, right? Like you've already kind of hinted at, like oscillation, right? But more importantly, resonance, synchrony. Oscillatory synchrony is something that's thought to underlie, like learning is thought to underlie the binding of different features into a single percept. To like go back to our example about like adversarial robustness, what's distinct about biological intelligence, like I've already said, is the fact that you perceive the entire feature hierarchy when you look out at the world. You see the individual pixel values, although probably not to the resolution of the individual photoreceptor in your retina, but you still there's a sensation, there's a phenomenological correlate of the low level feature, and then there's the phenomenological correlate of the outline of your body, the edges that I'm seeing, and then there's the actual reified three-dimensional percept of your entire body as like a volumetric
3D volumetric model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's all in one thing, right? It's also in the point about feedback, right? And the point about optical illusions playing a role is that they show that, like when you see that Kanizsa square, the parts aren't there to make a square, but you still perceive a square that almost looks like it's brighter than its background.
So why do people see the square?
Because of how that, and that's the very, well, now we're getting into really detailed information, but it's actually quite simple, right? And this is something about, you could extract a lesson here that you could use for machine intelligence, but think about like the limitations of the visual system at the very first stage, meaning at the retina.
Rods and cones,
but then where is most of the resolution limited to? The fovea, the center of your vision, right? And then you have the blind spot, and then you have the retinal vasculature that's also concealing, that's also like covering everything.
right?
Not everything, but covering significant portions. So what does that mean? What does that mean, right? How do you solve, if you had a pinhole camera, you couldn't get a full view of the entire world. The only solution to that is to move that, to get different views and to reconstruct the image. And so that's why Grossberg's model of visual processing actually has two separate streams. It has a boundary completion stream, which is what completes the edges of that square, but then it also has a surface filling in. So it's almost like the brain is reconstructing the visual world by drawing in the edges and then coloring it in, which is super counterintuitive because people are probably they're primed to think of the eye as almost like a camera, right? Like you get the full visual information in this one snapshot of the world, but you don't. The reality is that much of what I'm seeing right now when I look at you is being reconstructed around the edges of the center of my vision, right? In my peripheral vision, I mean. So the reason you see a fully fledged square is because your brain has learned the heuristic that when edges align, they connect in some way, right? And additionally, you see the actual square because the brain is like, oh, there's an edge there. There's these edges that collinearly align so as to form what would seem like a square. Therefore, I'm also going to fill that surface in, and that's why So let's actually test this hypothesis. When you see this square, tell me if you see it. If I could only find it. I think you introduced it pretty early on. But you see that, I'll let you.
You okay? I was gonna throw a bomb in here. Like so you mentioned it reconstructs the two edges, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can you extrapolate that to higher order fields or hyper complex fields? So in other words, can a higher order Gestalt just reconstruct when it in contact with another Gestalt? Am I following?
Yeah, you have hierarchical compositionality all the way up. That's probably how you have. Okay, so if we think of pixels, edges, 2D shapes, 3D objects, what's after that? What would be after that? Full
3D time series?
Yeah, like the actual
dynamics.
Yeah, with the time temporal component. I mean, I can't think of an example. You're basically trying. Oh, here. Okay, so when you focus on the A1. When you see that square, does it look like the square is almost popping out, or does it almost look like the white of that square is a slightly different shade than the surrounding white? Maybe this stuff is also messing.
No, I thought you were going to ask me, does it look like the Pac-Man are just circles being covered, or
there's that too, yeah. That's the other interpretation. So that's, you're actually getting into like another aspect of Gestalt psychology, which is multi-stability, right? So you have a system that can like entertain, right? In the face of ambiguous data, it can entertain like different interpretations, and it can flip between those different interpretations. But here's the thing, when you look at it now, you have those two interpretations in mind, right? Either the like two Pac-Man figures that are like hugging the square versus behind, or four circles that are behind the square.
Behind versus taking a bite out.
Taking a bite out of it, yeah. Now, okay, so focus on one interpretation, then switch to the other. When you switch to the other interpretation, does it feel like a continuous switching, or does it just feel like almost like a snapping, like from one interpretation to the next?
I notice a jump in my saccade.
Yeah, but it feels like it's discontinuous.
Yeah, it's discrete.
It's discrete, right?
So what is it for you? What's your flip?
No, for me it's discrete. I don't ever see like a continuous shifting from one interpretation to the other. It's almost like the system goes from one attractor to the next one, which is back and forth. So you almost have like from analog computation, right? You have a digital discreteness to it, which is, I think, quite fascinating.
Yeah, there's a word for that. I forget what it's called. It's not a memristor, is it?
Memristor? I don't know too much. I know those are like from neuromorphic hardware, right?
Can I switch but still keep on the object reconstruction part, or retinal optics reconstruction? How do you think that was evolutionarily contrived?
Oh, right.
Because you know, like, I'll just give you a hint, but I know you already know the answer, but like, evolution was designed so that things that didn't move could move initially. They could sense and actuate. And that's dopamine facilitated.
Yeah. Well, that's already when you have like vertebrates. Well, I don't know how many. I think vertebrates probably use dopamine. I don't know that invertebrates do, because bees don't use dopamine. They use octopamine, it still plays the same role as dopamine. But okay, so you're saying, why did evolution make the eye so like shitty at sensing the visual world? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Well, I guess that's loaded, right? Because we do a good job at sensing for the sake of survival and reproduction, the two tenets, right? But I guess my question is like, yeah, why was the development so convoluted? Do you have any hypothesis with respect to that?
So I guess we have to specify how it's convoluted, right? It just seems very convoluted that you would have you would have all, like, most of the resolution, most of the photoreceptors concentrated only in the center of the retina, as opposed to having them like having more just across the entire surface to get more of an actual camera-like quality to the eye. And when you think of evolution as trying to get the best deal in terms of survival and like metabolic cost, it makes sense, right? So evolution is, I hate using the term like evolution design or evolution wanted, because it's almost like we're assigning a kind of teleology to it, but it's, of course, it's a compression. Hopefully anybody that's listening up to this point is probably the kind of person that understands. Now we're using metaphorical language here, but yeah, like the reason that you don't have a ton of photoreceptors across the entire retinal surface is probably because it would be more metabolically expensive to have that. And so evolution was like, well, if you can do the same thing with less, why not do that, right? There was another point.
Yeah, why put the ganglion in front of the retinoptic sensor?
Yeah, so there's some like energy conservation principle at hand where you're not minimizing just like, you're not just trying to get the most like fit organism, you're trying to get the most fit organism for the least amount of metabolic expenditure.
Right. So it seems almost like if there is a genuine teleology here, it's not that we survive and reproduce, but that we self-replicate the genome.
Yeah.
Right.
It's all downstream of that. There's like a very what do you call it? A very continuous transition. It's a continuum, right, from life to mind. Well, because mind is a subset of life. We don't know of minds that aren't alive. So the purpose of a mind of perception is still playing by the same rules as what guides organisms to differentiate themselves and diversify evolution.
So now for the drum roll, how does this all relate to Kuramoto?
Well, so Kuramoto oscillators are basically a mathematical framework for describing a set of coupled oscillators. So you have I'll try not to butcher this, but you have a phase offset term. I could be wrong about that. And then you have the important aspect really is the coupling kernel that essentially tells you, the coupling kernel determines how each unit in the system, so if you want to think of it as like a grid of cells, it tells you how each cell wants to couple with its neighbors. Like, so it's like the Mexican hat kernel idea. The difference of Gaussians, like well, it looks like a Mexican hat, right? So it's short range excitation, long range inhibition. So in the Kuramoto framework, that would mean that you want to couple with your nearest neighbors, and then you want to be anti-coupled, or like you want to have the opposite phase with the cells, the units that are further out from you, and that leads to, and that's actually, I believe, a subset of the kind of neural field equations that people were looking at in the 70s already, 70s, 80s.
Is that Amari?
Amari, Cohen, Ermintrout was a big guy. That's what was used to explain like the kinds of visual hallucinations that you see under the influence of psychedelic drugs, epilepsy, hypnagogia, like a bunch of different things. You can actually, you take these PDEs, you do some like space-time discretization, you run some numerical method to evolve them in time, and you see these spatial patterns emerge, provided that certain conditions are met, like you need a symmetric kernel, which the Mexican hat kernel is symmetric. Right. Symmetry in this case just means that you can commute the inputs of the arguments of the function, and the probably the easier way to understand it geometrically is just it's radially symmetric. So a Mexican hat kernel would be it looks like a Mexican hat. Think about it like that, right? So it's, yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm gonna
let you finish, but I'm gonna convolute it in a second. But finish what you're saying.
So the Kuramoto system is the Kuramoto oscillator framework is it inherits a lot of that, but it allows you to model like not just like a static activity level, but it allows you to model coupling dynamics, oscillatory dynamics. And so if you want to model like, okay, how do neurons synchronize with each other, both across space, like horizontally, and also like across the cortical layers, then at least to my understanding, a Kuramoto framework would be the right mathematical object to use.
So you mentioned it's only has to do with symmetric PDEs?
Symmetric kernels.
Okay.
So that coupling, but I don't know how that extends to the, I'm sure it inherits several of those properties from neural fields, but there's probably different mathematics, so I'll have to look.
And I think
more into
Amari worked with Frank Nielsen at one point, the information geometry godfather. So there's some interesting overlap here with respect to literally the three aspects we were talking about: perception, machine learning, and neurology.
Definitely.
But I wanted to ask, like, so where's the space for, just throwing words out here at this point, but like, where's the space for Jordan algebras or non-commutative or no?
I don't know a lot about that. I'm not an algebraist.
It's kind of like you put the way I hear it from teachers is you put your underwear on before you put your pants on. That's the type of algebra, matrix algebra is related to Jordan. But I guess what I'm saying is, why is it we live in a quaternionic or arguably octonionic system when I'm talking to you, but it also doesn't make sense to even make that assertion because we're in this system together. It goes back to the whole Conway's game of life thing. Not to butcher or bastardize everything you're saying and lower the caliber, but I'm curious, like, are there systems that respect higher symmetries that you can model, like beyond Kuramoto oscillation, something that takes into account the fact that there could be two anthropic agents.
You're going beyond just a single agent brain neurology level.
Yeah, like zooming into this development, you see the fractal, many people having conversations in their home at their chairs or doing their laundry.
Scale invariance. Yeah, I mean, like, wouldn't surprise me. I feel like reality probably, there's some aspect of reality. There has to be aspects of reality that are scale invariant. And when you look at biology, when you look at the continuum from single cell to multicellular, to now organisms that have nervous systems, to societies and stuff, it's kind of hard to not think that there's some kind of scale invariance, like a system of
weak links.
You
can have that, by the way. I think you enjoy that book.
And develop weak links to preserve our stability. Yeah, so like I feel like you can generalize a lot of this stuff to also like do sociological work. So like literally I just opened a random page here and it says complex systems may have learned to optimize their search for the absolute stability minimum, right? So like that's kind of
going back to what you said about metabolic inexpensiveness.
Yes. The only issue is defining, okay, what's the energy functional? That's the hard part. Well, shouldn't say it's the hard part, but like that's a non-trivial part because not every system is going to have the same, like, I'm going to be very careful when I say this, but like the same Lagrangian like type of energy minimization dynamics, but there's likely to be something like that for any system that exhibits a kind of any dynamical system that exhibits stability or even multi-stability, right?
So this is bigger, in this case, this is bigger than life, right? This is any dynamical system, just clarifying. I was going to argue there might be some biological thing that's sustained and generalized across all species, but if it's beyond life, then it's a moot point.
To Jen's point, she's mentioned this quite a bit. Le
Chatelier, how do you say that?
Le Chatelier. Chatelier, I think you actually said it more.
Le Chatelier.
But yeah, no, this is definitely like, there's scale invariance here for sure.
Final crescendo. How does this all relate to cybernetics? That is medical cybernetics or neural cybernetics or neurocybernetics?
Okay, so I'm thinking of the original term of cybernetics.
The communication between animal and machine, where machine is some type of transplant or bioelectronic, and the animal obviously is you. My question, I get, if I could just stir the pot a little bit, we already have Neuralink, we have Synchron, we essentially Neuralink being an electrode array that is implanted on the brain. You want to
continue?
All right, I'll be quick. And then you have Synchron, which is a stent that you put through the jugular tract and get rolled through the brain.
Was that it, or
Yeah.
was there something? Okay. I guess it depends. Well, I think the obvious answer that is super general and isn't going to be satisfying to anyone, including ourselves, is just understanding the dynamics of these systems allows you to manipulate them, right? So that's the very general no shit, obviously, right? But I think that's important because what do you want to do? If let's just pick neural cybernetics as an example. What are you trying to do?
So beyond healing people who got disabilities and people who essentially are physiologically or mentally disabled, I want to make partial differential equation, handwritten equation feel like ASMR. I want to minimize toil from the perception learning ambiguator.
So you're describing some neurotech that would essentially replace the kind of pharmacological enhancements people would use to achieve that, because that's something you can, just take a sufficiently large, and this is not medical advice, I'm just saying hypothetically, just take a sufficiently large dose of any dopaminergic compound like amphetamines, right? You're gonna feel a greater sense of reward doing just about everything, but clearly you're incurring a kind of a debt to your future self in doing that. So then the idea is, okay, how do we design an actual device that allows you to optimally shift modes for whatever it is that you have to do?
And can we get the Pac-Man and the white square, can we somehow make it so discrete that it becomes continuous, the flip rate?
But would you want that though? I guess, because I don't see that as I guess I don't see that as an issue. Would you want that?
Well, engineering-wise, it would allow for this whole shader aspect of your geometry. I can flip between shaders, make this bar scene look different.
Okay.
Make her face look different, make his arms look different.
Well, but then you could also there's some question. Well, not just ethical questions, but also desirability in the first place. Why would you want to do? You're talking about AR almost. Alternate reality.
Yeah, XR, yeah.
There's a question about what are the ethical implications of that? I think that this kind of technology, if we have the kind of technology that can manipulate your conscious experience, at will, that's going to be abused. The wireheading. I feel we've spoken about this in many of our conversations.
They already do wireheading in Kensington, Philadelphia.
Yeah, but imagine. So is the idea that we'd be able to wirehead with none of the drawbacks? If you just turn the dial on hedonic tone arbitrarily, well maybe not arbitrarily, but significantly above the human
Or you
baseline.
outsource all the neurological derived phenomenology to some type of cloud where there's no restriction. And they have a paper called Human Brain Cloud Interfaces. There's a perspective piece about this.
Do you trust corporations to have your best interests in mind when installing this technology in your brain?
I don't trust Verizon and Comcast to own the contents of my consciousness, but they already do.
But imagine if they owned it in a much more intimate manner.
That's for the viewer to decide.
Yeah, that's for the viewer to decide, honestly.
Hey, great conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I guess you're going to cut off any part after this, right?
I'm going to watch it with you, and then we'll watch it tonight, and then we'll...
What did you think, though?
I thought it was excellent. I think I shut the hell up, and you got a chance to speak.